A man spends the better part of his life building a shield around his children, hoping they never have to feel the sharp edges of the real world. But sometimes, that very shield becomes a wall that hides their true character until it is almost too late. I spent 25 years believing that unconditional love meant absorbing every single blow so my daughter and son-in-law could fly high. But I only succeeded in teaching them how to look down on the very man holding the shield. When the fog of heavy medication finally cleared on a cold Tuesday night in the recovery wing, I saw the truth through the clear eyes of a father who had almost lost his voice forever. And I realized a hard, unbreakable lesson. Blood gives you a title, but loyalty and respect are what make a family. Welcome to Dad's Mighty Revenge. If you believe that respect is earned through loyalty, and that a father's lifelong sacrifice should never be treated as a disposable stepping stone, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below letting me know where you are listening from today. I read every single one of your stories, and your support means the world to this community. To understand how a home fractures, you have to look at the quiet moments, the small, subtle shifts that accumulate over decades. My name is Arthur. I am 68 years old, and for 34 years, I ran a commercial civil drafting and structural engineering firm in the suburbs outside of Columbus, Ohio. It was grueling, detail-oriented work, 60-hour work weeks, dusty blueprints, endless site inspections in the freeze of winter, and the humidity of summer. When my beloved wife Eleanor passed away from stomach cancer 14 years ago, my daughter Vanessa was only 16. Devastated by the loss, I made a silent vow at Eleanor's funeral. Vanessa would never feel unprotected. She would never have to worry about rent, tuition, car payments, or the harsh realities of an unforgiving world. That vow became my biggest flaw. It is a mistake I have to own for the rest of my days. I substituted material comfort for accountability. When Vanessa dropped out of her second college program because the workload was unreasonable, I didn't push her to find a full-time job. I simply wrote a check for her rent on an upscale apartment downtown. When she met her husband, Derek, a man with high-end suits, grand entrepreneurial promises, and zero steady income, I paid for their $70,000 country club wedding. I even handed them the keys to a newly renovated 3-bedroom brick home on Willow Creek Lane that I owned debt-free, telling them to pay whatever rent felt comfortable. In 10 years, they didn't pay a single cent, and I never asked. I convinced myself that I was being a good, protective father. But in reality, I was raising 2 adults who viewed my sweat and sacrifice as their natural birthright. Contrast that with my late younger brother's son, Leo. My brother Marcus was a high school history teacher who died of leukemia 7 years ago. He left behind Leo, who was 19 at the time, working night shifts at a local logistics warehouse while going to trade school for electrician certification. Leo never asked me for a dime. When my gutters were backed up in autumn, Leo showed up on Saturday morning with a ladder before I even woke up. When my knees began to ache from old arthritis, Leo came by twice a week just to haul the heavy salt bags down to the water softener in the basement. He didn't ask for praise, he didn't expect a check, and he never assumed the world owed him anything. He understood the quiet language of carrying a burden. The turning point, the moment the floor completely dropped out, began on October 14th. I suffered a massive stroke on the left side of my brain while working in my home garden. If it weren't for Leo stopping by to drop off an extra sack of firewood, I would have died right there on the grass. Leo called 911, held my hand on the cold ground, and stayed by my bed at Riverside Methodist Hospital for 36 straight hours, while the surgeons worked to relieve the pressure on my brain. The stroke took away my speech for nearly 2 weeks and paralyzed my right side. The doctors told me that recovery would be long, painful, and uncertain. I was transferred to a private subacute physical rehabilitation center on Oak Ridge Parkway. My brain was fully functional, but my body was unresponsive, and my speech was reduced to slurred, barely audible grunts. To anyone looking at me from the outside, I appeared completely unconscious, a frail, helpless old man trapped in a medical bed. On the 3rd night in the rehabilitation facility, At roughly 9:30 p.m., the room was bathed in the faint blue glow of the heart monitor. I was lying under 3 thick hospital blankets, my eyes half closed, struggling to gather the strength to move my fingers. The door opened quietly. Vanessa walked in, wearing her designer beige trench coat, accompanied by Derek. They didn't come to hold my hand. They didn't bring fresh flowers, or ask the night nurse how my vital signs were looking. Vanessa walked over to the foot of the bed, crossed her arms, and looked down at me with a look of pure, impatient irritation. Derek didn't even look at my face. He went straight to the small bedside table, pulled open my personal belongings drawer, and picked up my leather wallet and phone. I kept my breathing steady, keeping my eyes heavy and closed, listening to every word. Vanessa let out a long, cold sigh that cut deeper than any surgeon's scalpel. She leaned closer to Derek and whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the dead quiet of the room. "The doctor said his speech might never come back, Derek. Look at him. He's completely out of it. We can't have him moving back into his house or coming to stay with us. It'll destroy our lives." Derek chuckled, a dry, cynical sound that made my skin turn cold. He said, "The mortgage on Willow Creek is clean, Vanessa. If we put your dad into a care facility, we can take full power of attorney, sell his primary estate on Maple Avenue, sell off his drafting firm's commercial building, and liquidate the portfolio. We can clear at least $1.2 million before the end of the year." Vanessa didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. There was no tear in her eye for the father who had protected her every step of her life. She whispered back, her words icy and deliberate, "Put him in the cheapest nursing home down in West County, the one near the old highway. We don't need to waste $50,000 a year on high-end care when he doesn't even know where he is. Let's get the attorney to bring the power of attorney documents on Friday. We'll just guide his hand to mark the signature page. He can't fight it anyway." They didn't see a father who had spent 30 years working 60-hour weeks so they would never know poverty. They saw an obstacle. They saw a broken bank account that was finally ready to be harvested. Derek slid my wallet back into the drawer, patted Vanessa on the shoulder and said, "Let's go grab dinner. I'll call the facility manager at West County tomorrow morning." The door clicked shut. Their footsteps faded down the linoleum hallway. If this story resonates with you, and if you have ever faced a moment where the people you poured your life into turned their backs on you the moment you became an inconvenience, please take a moment to subscribe. Sharing these hard truths is how we ensure no father ever has to feel completely alone. I lay in that dark room for 3 hours without moving a single muscle, staring at the ceiling tiles. The fever was gone, but a new kind of heat burned in my chest. The helpless old man who would forgive any slight just to keep his daughter happy died right there on that hospital mattress. A hard, cold switch flipped in my mind. The next morning, at 8 a.m., Leo walked into the room carrying a thermos of fresh black coffee and a warm home-cooked breakfast he had prepared before his shift at the warehouse. He didn't know I could hear him. He sat down in the vinyl armchair next to my bed, took a clean, damp cloth, and gently wiped my forehead. He whispered, "Hang in there, Uncle Arthur. I took 2 weeks off from work. I'm going to stay right here until you're back on your feet. We're going to get you home, no matter what it takes." I opened my eyes. I looked directly at my nephew, and with every ounce of willpower left in my brain, I squeezed his hand with my left fist. Over the next 4 weeks, I worked with a fierce, silent intensity that stunned the physical therapists. While Vanessa and Derek only visited once a week for 10 minutes, checking their watches and complaining about the parking fees, I pushed through the brutal speech therapy and physical rehab. I played the part of the frail, broken patient whenever Vanessa stepped into the room. I kept my speech low, slurred and hesitant. I let them believe their plan was progressing perfectly. When Derek smugly placed a stack of financial authority documents on my bedside table 3 weeks later, telling me, "Dad, these are just routine insurance forms to cover your care," I nodded weakly and signed a messy, barely legible signature on the top page, a document my personal attorney had secretly instructed me to sign as a dummy draft. Because behind the scenes, a very different set of papers was being prepared. On November 10th, 2 days before my official discharge from the rehabilitation center, I sat in the private conference room of the facility. To my left was Mr. Arthur Vance, my personal estate attorney and trusted friend of 30 years. To my right sat Leo. My speech was back, clear, sharp, and resolute. My mind was sharper than it had been in a decade. Mr. Vance spread the blue-bound legal folders across the table. He looked at me over his reading glasses and asked, "Arthur, are you absolutely certain about this? Once these trusts and deeds are executed, there is no undoing it. Vanessa will be completely cut out from the primary assets." I looked out the window at the gray November sky. I saw the empty parking space where my daughter had parked her luxury SUV, paid for by my loans. I looked Mr. Vance dead in the eye and said, "Derek and Vanessa built their expectations on my grave before I was even buried, Arthur. They thought I was deaf, dumb, and blind. It's time to teach them that a father's generosity ends the exact second his dignity is violated. Sign the documents." Monday, November 18th, 2:30 in the afternoon. The weather outside my home on Maple Avenue was crisp and freezing. The yellow oak leaves covered the long gravel driveway. Inside the house, the air was warm and quiet. I was sitting upright at the head of the dark mahogany dining room table, dressed in a sharp tailored suit, holding a hot mug of coffee in my left hand. Sitting beside me was Mr. Vance, his leather briefcase open, legal documents organized into neat, pristine rows across the wood. In the living room, Leo was sitting calmly, putting on his work boots, completely unaware of the precise terms of what had transpired over the last 10 days. At exactly 2:45 p.m., a high-pitched engine roared up the driveway. Vanessa and Derek pulled up in their late-model luxury SUV. They stepped out, carrying thick leather folders and smiling broadly. Today was the day they believed they were finalizing my transfer to the West County Care Facility and taking full control of my $2.5 million real estate and corporate estate. They unlocked the front door with their spare key, letting themselves in. They were laughing loudly about a reservation they had made at an expensive steakhouse for later that evening. They walked into the dining room, expecting to find a bedridden, confused old man sitting in a wheelchair under a blanket, waiting to be guided into a transport van. Instead, they found me standing at the head of the table, looking straight at them with total composure. Vanessa stopped dead in her tracks. Her jaw dropped slightly. The color drained from Derek's face as his eyes fell upon Mr. Vance and the official notary seal sitting on the table. Vanessa stammered, "Dad, what are you doing out of bed? Why aren't your bags packed? The transport van for West County is scheduled for 3 o'clock. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scream, and I didn't let a single drop of anger show in my eyes. Composure was the only weapon I needed. I said, "Vanessa, Derek, please, take a seat. We have family business to settle." Derek took a step forward, his voice tight, trying to maintain his dominant posture. "Arthur, what is this? Who authorized you to leave the rehab center? You're not mentally fit to be making decisions right now. We have the medical evaluation drafts right here." Mr. Vance cleared his throat, his voice steady and icy as he adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Mitchell, I suggest you shut your mouth and sit down. I am Arthur's legal counsel, and I have 3 independent neurological evaluations certified by the head of neurology at Riverside Methodist, proving my client is of sound mind, fully competent, and in complete control of his affairs." Derek froze. He looked at Vanessa, then back at me, a sudden wave of dark panic washing over his eyes. They sat down slowly at the far end of the table, their knuckles turning white against the polished wood. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the table. "4 weeks ago," I began, my voice clear and low, "I was lying in room 214 at Oak Ridge. My eyes were closed, my speech was gone, and I couldn't move my arm. You stood at the foot of my bed, Vanessa. You didn't hold my hand. You didn't ask if I was in pain. You looked at the man who raised you, who paid for your life, your home, and your wedding, and you whispered, 'Put him in the cheapest nursing home down in West County. He doesn't even know where he is.'" Vanessa's eyes went wide. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Dad, no, you were asleep. That's not what we meant. I held up my hand. Vanessa fell instantly silent. Do not lie to me in my own house, I said calmly. You saw a broken machine that was no longer useful to you. You saw $1 million in real estate that you couldn't wait to divide up while I was still breathing. You took everything I gave you and decided that your father was disposable. I tapped the thick leather folder sitting in front of Mr. Vance. So here is how the story ends, I continued. Effective at 9 o'clock this morning, the deed to the Willow Creek property, the home you have lived in rent-free for 10 years, has been transferred into an irrevocable family trust. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. If you are not out by December 18th, the county sheriff will remove your belongings. Vanessa shrieked, slamming her hands on the table as she stood up. Vacate? You're kicking us out of our house? Dad, you can't do this. Where are we supposed to go? It was never your house, Vanessa, I replied quietly. It was my generosity. Generosity that you threw in the trash. Derek's face went red, his breath coming fast. What about the drafting firm? What about the Maple Avenue estate? Mr. Vance picked up the top document and read with absolute precision. The entire commercial portfolio, the Maple Avenue estate, and all liquid investment accounts have been placed into the Arthur Watson Family Foundation Trust. The sole primary trustee and beneficiary of the estate, effective immediately, is Leo Watson. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Derek looked as if he had been struck across the face. Vanessa turned to look at Leo, who was standing quietly in the doorway of the dining room, completely stunned by what he was hearing. Vanessa pointed a trembling finger at Leo, her voice shaking with rage and tears. Leo? You're giving everything to Leo? He's just your nephew. We are your real family. I stood up straight, buttoning my suit jacket, looking down at my daughter with total, unbothered clarity. Blood gives you a title, Vanessa, I said softly. Character makes you family. When I was lying in that hospital bed, suffocating in my own helplessness, Leo gave up his work, sat by my side, wiped my forehead, and made sure I was cared for. He didn't ask for a dime. You looked at my body and calculated how fast you could sell my life's work to pay for your luxury. I walked over to the front hallway, opened the heavy oak door, and let the cold winter air blow into the foyer. The locks on Willow Creek will be changed in 30 days. Your credit cards attached to my business accounts have been canceled as of 20 minutes ago. You are two healthy, capable adults. Go out into the world, find jobs, pay your own rent, and learn what it means to earn your keep. Derek didn't yell. The brutal, cold reality had drained every bit of fight out of him. He grabbed his briefcase, looked down at the floor, and walked out toward the car with his shoulders slouched. Vanessa stood in the dining room, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sorrow or remorse, but the bitter, ugly tears of a child who had finally realized the endless river of unearned comfort had dried up forever. She walked out without another word, the heavy front door clicking shut behind her for the final time. When the house fell silent again, Leo walked into the dining room. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. He looked at the legal documents, then at me. He stammered, "Uncle Arthur, I didn't do any of that for money. I don't want your estate. I just wanted you to get better." I walked over, placed my hand firmly on my nephew's shoulder, and looked at the young man who had saved my life in more ways than one. "I know you didn't, Leo," I said gently. "That is precisely why it belongs to you." The peace that settled over my home that evening didn't come from a warm family reunion or a soft circle of forgiveness. It came from the unbothered clarity of a father who had finally done his job correctly. I had stopped protecting my daughter from the consequences of her own coldness, and in doing so, I had finally given her the only gift that truly mattered: accountability. Thank you for listening to this story on Dad's Mighty Revenge. If this narrative reminded you of the value of standing up for yourself, knowing your worth, and refusing to let your sacrifices be taken for granted, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Knowing your own worth and setting firm boundaries is the greatest lesson a father can ever teach. Stay strong, look after the ones who look after you, and I will see you in the next story.